Welcome to our Profiles in Leadership series. It offers an unparalleled opportunity to glean insights from top leaders who serve in government, education, the private sector, and civil society. In each episode, we invite these leaders to reflect on their journey and share skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. I am delighted to have with me Teresa Artis. Teresa is a media attorney at Trans World Radio in Cary, where she counsels on licensing and compliance matters. She is also on the Board of Trustees at the University of North Carolina and an adjunct professor at the law school as well as at Campbell Law School. Previously, she was vice president of business affairs at the Turner Broadcasting subsidiary in Atlanta, Georgia, and general counsel of Capital Broadcasting Company in Raleigh. In her role at CBC, she had legal and regulatory responsibility for radio and TV stations, web and mobile entities, a satellite service provider, and a AAA baseball team. Welcome, Teresa.
Glad to be here.
One of the things that I noticed just of looking at your CV is that you seem to have remarkable clarity as to what you wanted to do professionally. So, why don't we start there and take us through how you decided, one, that you wanted to do business in addition to law, and then two, that you wanted to go in-house early on, and really you have stayed with it for most of your life so far.
It's funny you see clarity because I always tell students life is not linear. So, to the extent that we try to plot our path, very often, you have things that occur. So it doesn't seem as, straightforward in the moment. But I guess you could say that I've always been fascinated by media. And the reporters that were involved in Watergate and just that whole concept of what's the role of the media in the time of national crisis, I guess you could say. And what's the role of the lawyer? I mean, when you look at what was happening with the congressional hearings at the time, the Senate hearings. So I was very blessed that I was able to bring together two interests of mine in terms of the role of the law and the role of media. But actually, by the time I got through, and that was my years pre-college. By the time I got to college, though, I must say I had become much more business oriented, ironically. I went to a wonderful university, UNC-Chapel Hill, that had a great journalism school, still does, and a good law school. But by the time I hit my college years, I did become much more interested in economics. So I went to business school first. And it was in business school that I decided to apply to law school because even after my first year, within my first year of business school, I realized this law thing was still an interest to me. But I can tell you by that time, I was very interested in how businesses make operational decisions and how they make strategic decisions. And looking at it from a legal standpoint was something that was beginning to really interest me by that time.
And you at Harvard. Mm-hmm. Now, what do you think, apart from the brand, and you can talk about that too, but I want to go beyond that so that people can understand what it actually was like being somebody amongst the people who were there, the experiences that you saw and felt and learned there, that you think helped shape both you and your career.
I tell people, for me at that time, Harvard was like an academic New York in the sense of just people from all over the world coming in. I mean, at any point in time, you could see a head of state that would be on campus speaking. I mean, it was just such a cross section of the world in terms of research and scholarship. And so it was tremendous buzz just being on campus. And that was a wonderful thing as a student. I mean, just Cambridge and Boston itself is a wonderful place to be a student with all the universities there. So it's just a very vibrant academic setting. I really, really enjoyed it. And when I was back in March for a conference, it just really reminded me what a special place it was.
So then you graduated, you went into practice for a few years, but only a few years, because then you decided, I want to go into media. How
Well,
did
I
you
mean,
decide?
I had a law firm experience, which I am very happy about. And frankly, I think it's very difficult to go straight into an in-house experience, because we typically don't have the bandwidth or the resources to do the kind of training that law firms can do with young associates. So I'm forever grateful. And I'm forever grateful for going into a transactional area. I was in banking, because as a transactional lawyer now, drafting is something I do all the time. And when you represent money, you learn how to draft very well. so, so I'm very grateful for the experience that I had in representing financial institutions and just seeing how money works. So it also built upon my economics interest as an undergrad major. And I just am very glad that that was a solid foundation for me as a transactional attorney. Because part of what we just do in dealing with the relationships is figuring out how to allocate risk, how to deal with money flows. And so that was a very good foundation for me.
So why communication? I mean, journalism, it goes way back, but then
Right.
it also has really carried you through all of your professional life. And you just talked about importance of communication, even in banking.
Mm-hmm.
Why did that particular skill set resonate so strongly with you?
Well, I think also it was with Turner, just an interesting mix of news and entertainment. And before I left the firm, I actually did sit down and had a career counselor just talk to me about what my interests were. And as we were just trying to see, do you really see a law firm long term as being your life? And the answer was no. I mean, I wasn't a rainmaker, didn't see that as my fit. But when she asked me, what are some things that have always been big in your life? And one was the arts, the performing arts. I mean, I started dancing at age 3 and danced through college. And
You still
so,
dance?
no, I don't dance in that sense now. But just the whole notion of working in an environment where you had a certain aesthetic appeal, where you had a certain creative environment, even if I was not on the creative side of working with people who were in marketing or in or doing the creation of programming, really intrigued me. And so by going to Turner, it was a wonderful mix of hard news, but also on the entertainment movie side or TNT's sports side, a mixture of the whole gamut of news and entertainment. So it was a really good fit, I think, in that regard.
What did you learn? Share with us your takeaways in terms of what a leadership looks like.
Well, I think at that time, with Ted Turner very involved in the business, when you say, what does leadership look like? If you use the example that he set for all of us, it was be willing to operate without precedence. Ted Turner, in starting CNN, was a person who said, I don't care that there's never been a 24-hour news service. The whole notion that people laughed at, that people would be willing to watch cable 24 hours a day, one channel on, one topic, was seen as absurd. But his idea was, I don't care if it's never been done before, this is something I want to do. So I was in an environment that was extremely innovative, that was very much out the box, very entrepreneurial within the company, which encouraged that kind of thinking, of stretching yourself, where you had lawyers who became P&L owners in terms of, the head of the Hawks was a lawyer. I mean, just on down the line, there were about 90 some lawyers at that time. Only 30 were in the legal department. So we were in operating units all over the company and the subsidiaries. So it was a very intriguing place to be, as an employee and as a lawyer as well. If you had something to contribute to a conversation, they didn't care if you were a lawyer. You could say it, even if it was in a marketing context. And so it was a very interesting place to be, a very formative part of my professional career, Turner Broadcasting.
And so you felt that as a young person coming in with good ideas to contribute, you were being heard, your ideas were being respected, and you were allowed to grow.
Absolutely, because I was not in the legal department either. I was
Yeah.
the first lawyer that the general counsel had not hired. I was hired into sales because at that time, that the head of domestic sales wanted their own attorneys in that entity and not have them in legal. And so, to your point, you had lawyers being able to be in positions where you were interfacing constantly with people in finance, people in marketing. And so it was just a very, very excellent environment for somebody like me, particularly as a JD and BA, who
Yeah.
liked to be around operational issues and day-to-day business issues.
Now, how can we encourage more of that type of openness and creativity and respect for different ideas across organizations?
Well, I think quite honestly, a lot of time business people don't know what to do with lawyers.
Yeah.
Don't see the creativity and the ability of lawyers to, synthesize across all kinds of topics. I mean, generally, we're the window to a lot of areas because when problems come, they usually aren't just in silos. They usually interface with all types of departments across a company. And your, what I call secure business people, will be happy with lawyers interfacing in different ways and not just put them in a box. And so that's why I said my Turner experience was very formative, because as a lawyer, to your point, I was valued for all aspects of my analytical ability. And it was quite impactful for me.
Yeah. And you do a lot of negotiation.
Yes, yes.
For a lot of people, negotiation probably ranks up there with public speaking in terms of the things they would rather they would rather be dead than do. So you do it, and walk us through how you got into it and kind of shed light on some of the bugbears and myths of negotiation.
Well, I mean, it's funny when I think back to where I started my career in banking. Negotiating in banking was a lot different than negotiating in the in media or the entertainment area. Banking being regulated in a sense, or you having certain types of roles and dynamics, particularly if you represent money. In my case, representing the banking institution. The way you interact with a borrower is going to be a lot different, given you're in a different power position than they are, given they're in need of you and what you have. In the media environment, I often say can be very incestuous, in the sense that you have deal making happen all the time. You have people who creating content and people who are also distributing content, and sometimes the roles change. So you never can, or you should be careful to be too heavy-handed, because that person across from you may be part of an entity that owns you in another year or two, just given the nature of how the business works, because there's so many different aspects to it. And so that changes how you interact, but it also helps you appreciate the importance of relationships, the importance of understanding what an organization brings to the table, and how that can shift with technology changes, with the changes in the interest and whims of audiences who can be very fickle. So that's why, unlike banking, you have to be recognizing there's a much more fluid situation. And so negotiations in our world, in the media context, have to be done with that mindset, because dynamics can change very quickly.
And how did you learn all of this?
Well, a lot comes with learning and observing. And some of the toughest negotiations I've had have not been with lawyers, but with business people who just knew what the deal making terms were, knew the value at hand. I mean, if you don't know what you're worth, if you don't know what your organization is bringing to the table and how the market values you, you can't be a good negotiator.
So you need to do your homework first.
Right. I mean,
yourself.
so if you're new, when as a new lawyer coming into entertainment and not in media and not realizing what I could give or what I needed to hold on to, sitting and watching and observing again what the market valued and what my power was, it took a while. I mean, the then general counsel of what's Dish Network now, I remember apologizing to him after my first year because that first negotiation I had, which was with him, I went, full bore on everything, not realizing what was important, what wasn't important. You went to the hilt on everything because you really didn't have the sensitivities you needed as a negotiator to realize, oh, this is a gimme. Make them think they're getting something. This is really what you want. And that's something you really don't gain as a negotiator in terms of those sensitivities until you understand what the industry values or what the market values in terms of your listeners or viewers. So it takes time to really observe and get to understand that.
Now, we talk about the process of negotiation, but there are other aspects of negotiation. So you tell me whether there are things that were important: time and place, how you were dressed or how the other side was dressed, the number of people in the room, the venue. How do any or all of these things play into your equation or your strategy in negotiation?
I mean, all those are important. Also, culture. One of the things I've certainly learned now with TWR is, differences around the world, the rhythm of negotiations. In the US, we may be very hard charging, it's got to happen now, where in other parts of the world, they'll just wait you out because their time, their value of time and their view of time and they're willing to be patient, knowing that typically as Westerners, we are very impatient and want stuff's done now when it may not necessarily, need to be done now. Or in our haste, you give up things just because you're ready to move on to the next deal when other people are just biding their time. And out of attrition, you may end up losing more just because you didn't understand the rhythm of the culture. So that has been, I think, something for me in my early years of TWR, just to see the difference in the rhythm that you run across when you start dealing with things internationally.
And you negotiate all around the world.
Well, I help support others who do. Very often, one of the things you find in different regions of the world, it can be better for folks within their region to be at the front. I mean, it's just the way the world works. So you may be there assisting, you may be behind the scenes assisting, but very often people want to feel very comfortable and with who they are, recognizing certain cultural cues. And sometimes it's best to have people within region.
So does this mean you use local counsel a lot?
I'm speaking of not necessarily lawyers. I mean, can you imagine that some people don't always feel comfortable with lawyers?
Oh, my heavens. Tell me about it.
So, I mean, it's understanding as lawyers, sometimes we need to be, have humility and take a step back and allow the relationship managers, you may say, the people for whom they may have been born in that part of the world, be the leaders, and you just take a step back because they can get a lot more done than you can in terms of creating a sense of comfort or peace or trust that you as an outsider would take you forever to develop. So that, that's sometimes not just with wisdom, you just realize.
So, what you just said, I think maybe 1% out of 100 of lawyers would have noticed. And I think it's absolutely true. But because most lawyers just think in terms of rules and how do you get the deal done? They don't really think about these other aspects. So a blessing, I think, coming into the law with a business background is that you think, first of all, from the business, but underlying the business, the human perspective.
Well, even more so, I would say in the last 10 years by working for a Christian ministry, a global ministry, they are much more relational. I mean, the idea is, frankly, we're all on the same team. Even though as lawyers, we would say we're across the V, we are, technically opposite each other, potentially in a transaction. They don't see themselves as adversarial in the traditional sense. And so, ethically as a lawyer, sometimes I have to say to people, wait a minute, I'm not your lawyer, because they may or may not, and this is often the case in the nonprofit world, have a lawyer there, and they see me more just as the scribe to, make sure this relationship or arrangement is properly documented. But I think for a lot of nonprofits where you have entities that are collaborating together and are working on something, they don't take the traditional adversarial role. So being very strong in terms of relational skills, your soft skills, is critical. Otherwise, they're going to see you as a stumbling block when you need to be seen more as a person who is a professional listener, in my opinion, that makes sure that details get properly documented.
So let's talk about those relationships. When you're trying to push a deal hard, you're trying to get as good a bargain for yourself, but it may come at the cost of the relationship.
Absolutely.
So how do you know how hard to push and how much to give in?
Well, I mean, a lot depends upon, is it short-term or long-term? If it's something where you see that this is an organization or a company that you could have a long-term relationship with, then I think it's critical that you be mindful of how you do the deal. Because you and I probably have seen situations where I have had a deal documented on paper, but given the strength of the relationship, people never looked at it, never looked at the paper. And if, they needed to modify it, there was enough trust there via emails or whatever to have modifications done. I've done other deals where every, T-I crossed, and, you finished it and you count your fingers afterwards, and you don't trust from that point on that you probably will see the end of the term of that contract, because their relationship is so frayed or the trust is so low. So relationship for long-term deals, I think, really is essential because you're going to be living with these people. And more than likely, the needs of both are such that you need to have the relationship be strong for the long-term sake.
Sounds almost like a marriage.
Yeah.
Decide whether to push for it or whether or not you want to let it go.
And that's what I say to people. You as lawyers, sometimes you think that for us to be good, we have to be somewhat neurotic because we're always thinking about what could go wrong. But you do have to think about, okay, how would we manage this if we were not as happy with each other, and try to prepare for, those days. So in that regard, I guess you're right. It can be seen very much like a marriage in some instances, particularly your long-term arrangements.
Let's talk about compliance. That's also what you do. And, a lot of people at companies, they look at the lawyer preaching compliance and it's almost like, oh no, there she goes again. There she goes again. Getting in the way, telling us what to do. How do you foster a culture of compliance?
You come alongside and you don't look like the person wagging your finger in their faces. You have to understand the business. You spend a lot of time coming beyond alongside to understand what their business needs are. So you can help them see that what you're trying to do is make their life easier. I mean, for example, with when I was at the TV station with marketing people, I said, the reason why I'm trying to help you understand what are things we should and should not do with our advertising clients is because I don't want you to lose money out of your advertising budget. Because if we end up getting sued because of the way this, ad was shot, or, whatever, an insurance risk, given a contest, guess whose budget is coming out of? So I'm on your side in the sense of I want to bring people in to help you understand issues of risk so that you will have even stronger relationships with your clients, because they won't be mad at you because the ad campaign blew up, and that we don't have issues legally with any of our regulators. So, but the key thing is people have got to feel that you understand what their businesses are, so that they see it worth their while and that you have their best interest at heart.
And how do you go ahead?
I think you do that through what you and I do as educators. One of the most important things I think for a lawyer to do effectively, if you're in-house, is to know how to teach. And teaching adults is not just wagging your finger, it's coming alongside, it's seeing them as equals, where you are learning from them, they learn from you. And I spent a lot of time teaching. I mean, it's just like with a child, and adults are no different. People are rebellious with rules they don't understand. If they don't understand the reason for the rule, they're not going to comply. If you spend the time to help them understand the reasoning, then they're more likely to be obedient. So I think it's the teaching aspect that's critical.
Now, do you have to switch frequencies when you talk to the government? In your CV, you also have those interfaces with the FCC. You've spoken to folks on the Hill in Congress. Tell us how those interactions have been like.
Well, and with TWR, since I'm doing more international work, my FCC involvement or work there has been low, because we have very little FCC involvement with our international transmissions or radio stations. But certainly there are rules, compliance rules, when you lobby or when you interact with government officials, that as lawyers, I was very fortunate to have a Washington counsel to help me learn, because it wouldn't be something that would come natural to you. And so I do think that one of the key things for lawyers in innovative areas, and I've been very fortunate to work in media areas where technology was constantly changing, and you're trying to help the FCC understand your business, and you're trying to learn from them how they're going to apply rules. Just interacting with government and not seeing them as a necessary evil is critical. So it's a mindset thing. So I think the first thing you have to do to best represent your client is not to have an anti-government mindset of these people in the feds are just in the way, this is an unnecessary evil I have to do, rather than saying, oh no, there is something to be gained by this relationship. There's something to be gained by this exchange, and taking it on in that manner. So I think that was the first thing for me as a lawyer, to see that whole thing is important.
So after that first thing, once you have gotten that the government is not the work of the devil mentality out of your mindset, how do you get your agenda onto their agenda?
Well, when it comes to new media technology, we found, because I was fortunate when I worked at Campbell Broadcasting to work for a TV station that was the first to broadcast in high definition TV in the country. So they were pioneers in high definition television and digital television. So we found, frankly, that a lot of people in the FCC were very fascinated to learn, because we actually brought a live truck up to DC, had demonstrations with, high definition TVs. So people could see us transmit and just have our engineers talk through with FCC staffers things that they may not know without going to a local TV station. So, and we also had commissioners come down to our local station and, see operations. So you would be surprised how a lot of people in Washington, at least in the FCC, we saw for people who are doing innovative things are interested in having hands-on discussions or the ability to ask questions of people operationally that they would not if they're in their offices.
It sounds like you had a compelling message and you knew how to sell it in a compelling way.
Well, I think I was very fortunate in that the people I was working for, the head of Capital Broadcasting, were respected innovators, and people wanted to hear from them, and that was a blessing. It really was a blessing.
So you touched on this earlier, a strategic council, the global mission entities producing content for indigenous people in oral cultures. I know that's a passion of yours. So talk to us about that aspect of your work, which not too many people, I think, come across, and why it's something that it's important and they should think about.
Well, it's the reality that much of the world is still oral. There are oral societies that may or may not have written languages, who are getting along quite well, and that may not be their first priority. The issue is, how do you, in my mind, respect creative gifts wherever you may find them? We have people in our ministry, as you have nonprofits around the world in education and so forth, who find stories, who find artistic expressions in societies that may not have them written. And the question then is, how do you avoid misappropriation of creative talents when the person you're interacting with may not be able to read or write? And the IP culture you and I, as Western lawyers, deal with is one where you have licensing, which is written typically. You have a conveyance of IP rights written. You know, we have doctrines and concepts that say it must be documented in some form or fashion to have a true conveyance. So how do you do that in contexts and societies where they aren't able to, you know, understand a written text? These are the things that I saw myself interacting with in terms of issues when I had producers going out in the field, and they would bring me back, you know, consents or releases for IP with thumbprints on them, which said to me, okay, more than likely this person may not have fully understood what it is that they were signing, so or attempting to show expression of consent for. So it goes to this whole notion of, how can we respect someone's rights as a creator when the context and IP that we are used to working with says you need to be able to read and write? So I'm glad that there's scholars out there who are looking at this issue from a pragmatic standpoint. I would say for myself, what I have been saying to people is, have an exchange, have an oral exchange, which you document with your phone. It is memorialized, even though it may be in a digital file, not in a paper. If you had to have an independent third-party translation of it, you know, you could do so. But my issue is, can we honor the creator while the rest of us in the legal world figure out what are the ways that we have our textual structure interface with that kind of context?
So is that what you do now? Is that part
Well,
of
that's what I have interacted with as an issue. And when we do face those kind of contexts, people usually do record rather than continue to send me documents with fingerprints on them.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
But I am looking forward to seeing how other people are addressing this issue. I have heard that for some health organizations, that WHO actually has said when people go into certain indigenous areas, that it's okay for them to get health consents orally, as opposed to requiring people who may not be able to read or write provide some kind of written consent. But I think it's something that we should say, okay, we want to honor elders in those kind of contexts and not make them feel disgraced because they don't understand a written text. What can we do in those environments and still get the consents that we need?
You know, I find it striking and encouraging that you talk about honor in these communications. We often take for granted that it's about the law, it's about what you put on paper, rights and obligations. But most of the world operates exactly the way you described, which is it's a shame honor culture. And it's not a culture where what you put on a piece of paper is all there is to it. And I wonder how much, as companies venture abroad, as the world becomes more interconnected, there is that sensitivity to being able to transmit and receive in different cultural frequencies, the way that you seem to be able to do almost as a second nature.
Well,
I wonder if that's something we can teach.
Well, I think we do need to develop cultural competencies. And I'm always interested in developing them. I certainly don't want to suggest at all that I've developed in this area. I'm stumbling to learn as I interface with people who've been in the field, mission fields, for a long time, as they say to me, these are the contexts. So that's why I hope scholars like yourself who have done research in various areas can share those findings with those of us who are in the trenches as in-house lawyers, because it would be very helpful. But I do think those kind of sensitivities are strongly needed. If you want to maintain a relationship with the creative community in an indigenous society, you've got to develop relationships where I think you show them honor. Otherwise you are, to me, continuing a pattern of appropriation, particularly from areas such as Asia and Africa that have gone on too long, where it hasn't been clear that those cultures have been honored always.
I want to quickly ask you about on the frequency of teaching, since we're talking about that now. An interesting course that you developed or you taught between 2004 and 2012 at Spring Arbor on Judeo-Christian values in dispute resolution. So how did you come across, why was that important, and what are some of the takeaways that our listeners should have about dispute resolution?
Well, the interesting thing is when you look at American jurisprudence, there's so many concepts that you can see that derive from Judeo-Christian texts. The whole notion of, you need to have a witness in order to determine the veracity of a statement. You just don't trust what somebody said without first hearing the other side, or the whole notion of when is a will valid. A lot of these little nuggets that we have in the law, we find where their roots are looking at sacred texts as it relates, particularly in issues of disputes. So one of the things you also can then say, if you can find some of these roots of solutions for litigation, given the root of the faith is one of love and how people should work together and live together, then there should be roots and lessons and concepts for working together in the same sacred text. Otherwise, what's the reason that we go to worship if it can't help our lives work together and only for when we're in dispute? So that's what the course was about, looking at issues of the role of humility, the role of humility, not necessarily from the standpoint of being a doormat, but of having concepts of one person's interest as important as your own. The whole, what we would say, the golden rule. So many of what I'd have to say, the Stephen Covey principles that you can find frankly, in sacred texts. So the whole notion was to try to use these concepts before you're in, armed conflict in terms of litigation, so that they can inform the way you live and certainly inform the way you interact with each other if you were to need to resolve an issue.
And as an educator, talking about that to a secular audience, what was their response?
Well, I think in that case, Spring Arbor is a Christian university, so that context, it wasn't secular, even though I think any faith community would tell you, you have as many conflicts within the faith community as you do outside of it. So these are concepts you can use wherever you are. I think one of the things that just very often we fail to do is just see how in the secular world, you would see a lot of these concepts as leadership development. How do you manage people? How do you have people who may have different backgrounds and diverse views realize you don't have to be uniform to find unity? It's using the same concepts you would call leadership development in a secular context to say, these are the things you need to learn in terms of skills if you're going to effectively lead in a faith context, or lead in a way where you are showing faith principles in terms of how you treat people kindly and so forth. So I just see these a lot of times as being just foundational concepts. And unfortunately, in our seminaries, often they don't have time to teach conflict management, when that's the reason why a lot of faith leaders leave their pulpits or leave their leadership positions, because they were never able to focus on developing those skills while they were being taught others. So the role I had was, my course was mandatory for anybody doing the leadership module in the Masters of Communication at Spring Arbor. The view was, we need to have these kinds of skills as Christian leaders, period. Just as you would if you were in any kind of context, because it's going to impact your ability to be effective, period. And so that's the reason why we have.
And are you still offering this course?
No, that ended, like you said, in 2012. So I am not, but one of the things that it helped me, I think, was just helping people bridge differences. I think in the process, it helped me develop passport with people who may have ideological differences, because it helps you help people see how they can see somebody else's point of view and not be antagonized by it. So I think it helped me develop skills as well as teach skills that help people reconcile differences more efficiently.
That skill is so important, and one that really runs through all that we have talked about. So you're not bringing it back again, it sounds like.
Well, no, it's just that what I'm teaching now at UNC and Campbell are different in that regard from a subject matter standpoint. Sure. So I've just moved to a different point in my life from what I'm teaching.
Well, one of the other ways that you give back, Teresa, is that you serve on boards. And you serve on a number of them and important boards. Chapel Hill, you do it at Rex Healthcare, you do it UNC-FM. Tell us why you decided, amidst all the other things that you're doing, busy with, that it was important for you to serve on boards, and talk a little bit about your leadership experience and experiences on those boards.
Well, I think they all have had different impacts on me. The first with Rex in the healthcare context was phenomenal. Healthcare is something we all need or will need. It definitely opened my eyes to the challenges of healthcare, but it also helped me realize that as long as you have humans involved in healthcare, you will have mistakes, period. So how do we manage expectations relative to what is quality care when you're dealing with people who are not perfect providing care. How can we be as transparent as possible? How can we provide the best training and best resources for staff? How can we recognize, particularly in today's world, the behavioral health and mental health issues of so many people in the community that then has an unbelievable impact on our healthcare system that they in many ways are not designed to handle. So for me, the healthcare service was eye-opening, and it was quite an honor to be a community leader who sees what truly phenomenal people do day in and day out in our healthcare settings. And with COVID, it was really heart-rending to see what they had to deal with and still try to, do their jobs. So, and then education, as you know, higher ed is a world unto itself, the academy. But it's so essential to our society. But I mean, we have such expectations, particularly in public institutions, that you have our communities that we serve and people who may never have crossed the threshold of your university, who have very strong passions about your mission. So it's an interesting juggling of stakeholders and various voices. And again, a phenomenal experience given, all that you have to just be mindful of in that environment. So yes, higher ed and healthcare, the media ones to me just are an extension of, my natural interests. But certainly my board service in healthcare and higher ed have been very, very informative and have been an honor for me.
And if you had to boil down to a skill or an insight or characteristic that you bring to these boards that you serve on, what would you say that is?
I'm told I ask sometimes tough questions. I like, and maybe this is the lawyer in us, I like trying to understand the root of issues. I don't like just hearing symptoms, but what is the cause of it? Otherwise, you just see yourself dealing with issues over and over again if you don't get to the root issue. I mean, in the healthcare context, they do root cause analysis and so forth. And I think there's a place for that in other areas too. So I think I do bring that interest in analysis and depth of review, but from a good heart.
Yeah, they must like it because in 2016, they gave you an award for being really a outstanding board member.
So I think it's important for alums to be engaged if they can. I mean, all of us have different life things that we're dealing with. Mm-hmm. But our institutions, and whether you're an alum or not, if you are in an area where there is a way you can give back, higher ed has such an important impact to communities. Their engine, their economic engines in many respects. And so I just think it's important for you as taxpayers, if nothing else, if it's a public institution, to provide value if you can, and try to come alongside and serve.
Is it harder these days to serve with the polarized and almost inflammatory type of environment that we live in, with ideologies being so sharply divisive, especially in education?
I think it's hard to do everything. Um, I, Education, yes. Healthcare, yes. But for so many areas, so much of the politics has infiltrated so many of our other environments. Um, I say that what I often see lacking is grace. Failure of people to give people benefit of a doubt, assuming that people mean something when they may not, just because they may not be part of their tribe.
Mhm.
So, I think we're putting people in boxes too quickly. And I think it's very important to take a step back and allow people to be heard, and show more grace.
Yeah. So, as somebody that's on the receiving side of the lack of grace, what advice would you have for them in navigating the type of environment that we're
You
just?
have to have tough skin. One thing this service has definitely taught me is tough, because as I said, people are very passionate.
And you can grow that tough skin.
People are not shy of showing of expressing their First Amendment right to, give their point of view. And you have got to have tough skin. You can't take it personally, even though sometimes that can be very difficult. You also, I think, learn more and more to stay in your lane. You don't necessarily have to give a judgment or opinion about everything. Sometimes I hear things and they just go in the ear. I don't process them if it's not necessarily something I need to be involved with. So I don't necessarily give a judgment to, where there may have been a period of my life that I felt I had to react to everything. If you do that in board service, given all that comes at you, you'll be worn out. So you've got to be discerning about what you allow yourself to engage in to protect yourself emotionally and psychologically. And I think that's critical.
Let's talk for a moment about mentors and mentees. In an interview you gave that was called My Carolina Story, you talked about your father. Was your father a mentor to you?
Yes, a big role model to me. I mean, I think our parents' life stories can impact us positively or negatively. I was very blessed and am very blessed. I still have my mother. My father passed last year, to have wonderful role models. And he said to me early on as a child, you have to know how to articulate your anger and be articulate in it. As a Black man growing up in the 50s, he knew it was not physically wise to say everything on the top of your mind in any kind of way. And so that shaped him. And, he shared that with me as to, there's a way to be as a person who has, concerns and feelings about things, to still stand and say, but saying in a way that still shows a certain level of understanding. And so, yes, he was definitely a strong mentor of mine.
What did you take from your mom?
My mother went to Penn State and had got her graduate degree in mathematics.
Oh, I'd say good for her.
So she is one. I took her to see Hidden Figures because I those were her contemporaries. She's in her early 90s, and she was like, "Oh, of course that's the way it was for women back in the 50s." Like, is this news? I mean, that was her life, particularly in the STEM areas. So my mother was one who is still a strong believer of women in STEM, women in mathematics. And you don't buy into this mentality of girls don't do math. I mean, I said that as a young girl to wiggle my way out of homework that I was tired of doing. And oh my gosh, I thought she was going to have a fit. I said something like, "Oh, girls aren't supposed to be good at math." Oh my God. She was so mad she couldn't even speak. So my mother is one of those Southern Belle Steel Magnolia types who, oh yeah, she is very, very special. Very, very, very special.
Who else would you consider to be your mentor?
I've had teachers who went beyond the call, who saw interest, that I had growing up, and said, you ought to read this. Forget what the syllabus is. Forget what the curriculum says I'm supposed to do. You need to go here. You need to do that. And that's what I think we're supposed to do as educators. We're supposed to encourage and equip. And I'm just so grateful for teachers who said to me, one in college, you need to own your education. Whatever you do, it's on you. Don't have anybody else to blame because we didn't cover it. You go for it. And so the ones who really put a fire underneath you, the ones who made you stretch, made you, get out your comfort zone, are the people that I, have such dear feelings for.
And are you doing any mentoring?
Oh, yes. I try to encourage, I try to push, I try to channel my parents, my mother in particular in that regard. Yes, because I do want to see them reach their full potential. And so sometimes I am hard on them when I think that they're being soft on themselves, because I just have a lot of belief in students that I teach, and I really want them to stretch.
Last question. 2023 and beyond, what should folks expect from Teresa Artis?
That I too will continue to stretch. One of the things I tell students, you've got to maintain a teachable spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Be always willing to learn. Be always willing to stretch. So for me, I'm no different. I want to be the best me I can be, whatever that is. And as a person of faith, I believe there is a divine component to that in terms of me getting insight. But that for me is what I hope 23 and beyond is, that I did not waste opportunities, that I was a good steward of the ones given to me.
And what a lovely note to end on. Thank you so much, Teresa, for taking the time to share your insights, your reflections on life and leadership, and all the best in your continued growth. I bet your mom would say that you are steel magnolia too. Stem or no stem.
Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed it.